In October of 1956, the Queen stood on a quay and watched her husband sail away, and she would not stand beside him again for 4 months. He went to the far side of the world, past the ice of the Antarctic, to islands no sovereign had ever reached, while she kept Christmas without him and spoke his name into a wireless microphone to a listening country. And before the winter was out, his closest friend would fall in a divorce. A foreign newspaper would print the word rift across its front page, and the most silent palace in the world would do the one thing it had sworn never to do. It would answer. The question was why a marriage that was not breaking needed so badly to be defended. If you enjoy the stories the official histories leave in the margins, subscribe and stay with this one to the end, because the answer to that question does not arrive until the very last of these islands is behind him. Chapter 1. A marriage watched by the household. By the autumn of 1956, the marriage of the Queen and her husband had settled into a shape the whole world could see and almost no one could read. From the outside, it was the most photographed partnership on earth. There was the balcony, the open carriage, the gloved hand raised to the crowd, the 2 children brought out for the cameras at Christmas. There was the story the country told itself, of a young queen and her handsome consort, married for love in the grey years after the war, carrying the weight of a new reign together. It was a good story. It was mostly true. And like every good story told about that family, it had been shaped, trimmed, and guarded by men whose whole profession was to decide what the public would be allowed to see. To understand the winter that was coming, it helps to see the 2 people as they actually stood that autumn, and not as the photographs arranged them. The Queen was 30 years old. She had come to the throne 4.5 years before, on a February morning in 1952, while she was half a world away in Kenya, and her father died at Sandringham. She had been crowned in the summer of 1953, before a congregation of more than 8,000 and a television audience, the like of which the country had never seen. She was the mother of 2 young children, a boy of 7 and a girl of 6, and she carried, every single day, the unbroken labour of the crown. The red boxes came with the morning and did not stop. The audiences, the papers of state, the signatures, the reading, the constitutional grind that pauses for no birthday and no illness and no absent husband. She had been raised inside all of it. She had no memory of a private life to mourn and no expectation of privacy to lose. The scale of what she carried is easy to say and hard to feel. She had been crowned on the 2nd of June in 1953, in an abbey packed with more than 8,000 guests, and the ceremony had been carried, for the first time in history, live into the homes of the nation, watched by an audience reckoned at more than 27 million people in Britain alone. In the months around the coronation, the number of television licenses in the country roughly doubled, as families bought their first sets simply to see her crowned. By 1956, she was the most watched woman on earth, her face on the coins and the stamps and the walls of offices across the Commonwealth. And behind the pageantry ran the machinery of a real and unending job, the daily boxes of state papers that followed her wherever she went, the audiences with her ministers, the reading and the signing, and the constant grinding attention the Constitution demanded of her, and would go on demanding every day for the rest of her life. There were the 2 children as well, and they matter to this story more than the pageantry does, because it was their father who was about to disappear over the horizon. Charles, the elder, the boy who would one day be king, had been born in the November of 1948 and was 7 years old that autumn. Anne, his sister, had come in the August of 1950 and was 6. They were of an age to notice an absence and to count the length of it, old enough to ask, through the long weeks of that winter, when their father was coming home. The marriage the winter would test was also a family, 2 parents and 2 small children. And when the machine spoke of duty and the Commonwealth, it was speaking, in plain human terms, of a father who would not be at the Christmas table, and of a mother who would sit at it without him. Her husband was a different kind of creature entirely. Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, was 35 years old that autumn, and he had spent the 4.5 years of the new reign learning, slowly and against his nature, how to be a man with no defined purpose in a house that was not his own. He was restless in a way the Queen was not. He had been born to nothing and had made himself into something by his own effort, and then he had married the one woman in the country whose position required him to give all of it back. The public saw the consort at her shoulder, half a pace behind, gracious and upright in his medals. What the household saw was a man forever looking for a job, forever colliding with courtiers who had decided long before he arrived that he was not quite one of them. This is the first thing to understand about the winter of 1956 and the 4 months that lay at the heart of it. The absence that was coming and the scandal that gathered around it did not fall on a marriage of strangers. It fell on a partnership that had already been tested hard, in private, for years, and that had learned to survive the testing behind a wall no newspaper had ever climbed. The wall had a name inside the palace, though no one printed it. The men who kept the wall lived by a creed as old as the century, and it can be reduced to 4 words: never complain, never explain. This was a palace built on silence, and it had made silence into an art. That silence is the true subject of everything that follows. For the whole of the reign so far, the private strains of the marriage had been managed by the same machine that managed everything else, the private secretaries and the equerries, and above all, the press office, whose single, unbending purpose was to make sure that whatever passed between the Queen and her husband in the corridors of Buckingham Palace stayed in those corridors. The country was given the balcony. The friction stayed behind the wall. And there had been friction. Anyone who tells the story of this marriage as an unbroken idyll is telling the balcony version, the one the machine was built to sell. The truth, drawn from the men and women who stood close enough to watch, is harder and more human. There had been rows loud enough to frighten a film crew. There had been a wound over the family name so deep that the husband is recorded by his own biographer, saying he felt like the only man in the country forbidden to give his name to his own children. There had been a temper in the car and a temper on the yacht, and a queen who, the witnesses agree, gave every bit of it back. None of it had ever reached print, because the machine did not permit it to. So when the autumn of 1956 brought its plan, that the Queen's husband would sail away alone for the best part of 1/3 of a year, the machine did what it always did. It arranged the story. The absence would be duty. The absence would be the Commonwealth. The absence would be a husband serving the crown in places the crown itself could never reach. Every word of that was true, and none of it was the whole truth. And the gap between the arranged story and the private reality is exactly where this documentary lives. He would be gone from October until nearly the end of February. He would miss Christmas. He would miss the birthdays and the ordinary weeks. He would put an ocean, and then a second ocean, and then the coldest water on the planet, between himself and his wife and his 2 small children. And while he was gone, that carefully guarded silence would face the hardest test it had known in the reign, and it would break. The story of how it broke, and why, begins not with the scandal, but with a much older ache. To see why a man would sail to the bottom of the world and stay there for 4 months, you have to see what the crown had taken from him first. Chapter 2. The officer the crown grounded. Before he was a consort with nothing to do, he had been an officer with everything ahead of him. This is the part of Prince Philip that the balcony photographs erased, and it is the part that explains the voyage more completely than any rumour ever could. The man who sailed away in 1956 was not running from his marriage. He was reaching back across 10 hard years for the one life that had ever been entirely his own. He had been born at the Villa Mon Repos on the island of Corfu in June of 1921, the only son of a Greek prince and a princess born deaf, into a family that lost everything within 18 months of his birth. The Greek monarchy fell. His father was arrested, tried, and banished for life. The family fled into exile aboard a British warship, and the infant prince, so the story goes, was carried out of the country in a cot made from a fruit box. He grew up without a country, without money, and very nearly without a family at all. His mother suffered a breakdown and was placed in a sanatorium when he was a boy, and for roughly 5 years he had almost no contact with her. His sisters married and scattered into Germany. He was passed between relatives, schooled in 3 countries, and learned very early the single lesson that would define him. If he wanted anything in this world, he would have to earn it himself, because no one was going to hand it to him. The bare facts of that childhood are worth setting down, because they made the man. When the Greek throne fell, his father was fortunate to escape with his life, for several of the men tried alongside him were shot, and he was spared with a sentence of banishment for life. A British warship, sent by a sympathetic king, carried the family out of Corfu, and the baby prince, too young to walk, was laid for the voyage, so the story goes, in a cot improvised from a wooden fruit box. His mother, who had been born deaf, suffered a collapse in his boyhood and was placed in a sanatorium in Switzerland. And for something like 5 years, the boy heard almost nothing from her at all. His 4 sisters married German princes and scattered into another country. He was passed between relatives in Britain and Germany, schooled first at Cheam in England, then briefly at Salem in Germany, and at last at Gordonstown in the far north of Scotland, the Spartan school where he flourished and rose to be head of the school. He had, in the truest sense, no home of his own, and he built himself out of the lack of one. What he earned was a naval career of real distinction. He entered the Royal Naval College at Dartmouth in 1939 and passed out at the top of his term, winning the King's Dirk. He went to war as a teenager and was good at it. At the Battle of Cape Matapan, in the spring of 1941, at the age of 19, he was in charge of the searchlights aboard a battleship in a night action against the Italian fleet. When he switched them on, he lit 2 enemy cruisers as cleanly as if they had been held up on a stage, and the British guns destroyed them. His commanding officer recorded that the young man's handling of the lights had greatly helped the result. He was mentioned in dispatches. He was, by the accounts of the men who served with him, exactly the kind of officer the Navy is built to produce: quick, fearless, technically sharp, and hungry to command. By the end of the war, he had risen to first lieutenant of a destroyer, and he was in Tokyo Bay in the autumn of 1945 when the Japanese surrendered, close enough to watch the ceremony that ended the largest war in history. The record of those years reads like a model naval career compressed into 6 of them. He had entered Dartmouth in 1939 and passed out at the very top of his term, carrying off the King's Dirk as the best cadet of his intake. He had served through the war from the Mediterranean to the Pacific. He had been 19 years old and in charge of a battleship's searchlights on the night off Cape Matapan, and his commanding officer's report had praised how much the young man's handling of the lights contributed to the result. He rose to be first lieutenant of a destroyer, one of the most demanding posts a young officer could hold. Few men his age had risen so far so fast on merit alone, and everyone who served with him took it for granted that he would go all the way to the top. He was 24 years old, and everything about his trajectory pointed one way. He was going to be a captain, and then, in all likelihood, an admiral. The sea was his. It was the one place where his name and his birth and his lack of a country did not matter, where a man was measured only by what he could do. Then he fell in love with the heir to the throne, and the sea began, slowly, to close to him. The peak of it, and the last of it, came in the Mediterranean. In the years after his marriage, from 1949 to 1951, he was posted to Malta, and there he lived the only stretch of ordinary married life he and his wife would ever have. He served with the fleet. He was promoted to lieutenant commander, and in the autumn of 1950, he was given his own command, a frigate, the first and, as it would turn out, the only ship that was ever truly his. For a few months, he was what he had always meant to be, the captain of his own vessel, master on his own deck, saluted for what he had earned rather than for whom he had married. Those Mediterranean years gave the marriage its one taste of ordinary life, and gave his wife a freedom she would never know again. For that stretch of time she was, as nearly as she could ever be, simply a naval officer's wife. She lived at a villa near Valletta that belonged to Philip's uncle. She drove her own car through the lanes of the island. She went to the hairdresser like any other young woman, and moved among the other wives of the fleet. Both of their children were born in these years, the boy in 1948 and the girl in 1950. She would say, long afterward, that this had been the only time in her whole life she was able to live normally. It was the before against which everything after would be measured, and it ended the moment the crown reached out for them. It lasted less than a year. In the summer of 1951, the king's health was failing, and the couple were needed for the public duties the ailing sovereign could no longer perform. Philip took what was called leave. He handed over his ship. He came ashore. And though no one said so at the time, he never went back. The command was gone. The career was gone. The one arena in which he had been entirely himself was closed, and it was closed not by any failure of his own, but by the slow, irresistible gravity of his wife's destiny. He was 30 years old when he gave up the sea. He would live to be 99, and in all the decades that followed, he never again held a job that was purely his, never again stood on a deck that answered to him alone. The men who knew him best believed that this loss never fully healed, that under the medals and the public briskness, there was always the ghost of the officer he had been and the admiral he might have become. Keep that ghost in mind, because 5 years later, when a plan was laid for a long voyage to the far side of the world, aboard a great ship, in command of nothing but carrying the flag to places no one else could reach, it would call to exactly that buried part of him. The crown had taken his ship. The Commonwealth was about to hand him, for 4 months, the nearest thing to one he would ever have again. Chapter 3. Constitutionally, I do not exist. The day his wife became queen was the day he lost the last thing that had been his own. He was in Kenya when it happened, on a working tour, and it fell to him to break the news. Word reached the travelling party in a roundabout way, through a local journalist, and then through the men of the household, and it was Philip who took his wife aside, turned off the wireless, and walked her out into the garden of the lodge to tell her, gently, up and down the lawn, that her father was dead and she was queen. He understood in that moment, better perhaps than she did, exactly what her accession would cost him. The details of that morning in Kenya have their own quiet power. The couple had spent the previous night at a game viewing lodge called Treetops, built up among the trees, and had gone on to a fishing lodge the people of Kenya had given them as a wedding present. It was there, in the African bush, that a young princess became a queen without at first knowing it, the news travelling to her by a roundabout chain, a local journalist, and then the men of her household, before it reached her husband. When it was confirmed, one of her ladies moved instinctively to embrace her, and then, remembering, sank into a curtsy instead, the first of the millions of curtsies that would meet her for the rest of her life. Her private secretary remembered the new queen in that hour as looking very composed, absolute master of her fate. She was 25 years old. Her reign had begun, and her husband's old life had ended in the same African dawn. It cost him his home, his name in his own house, and any hope of the ordinary authority that a husband of that era simply assumed. Before the accession, the young family had lived at Clarence House, and there, by every account, the household had been Philip's to run. His private secretary of the time drew the contrast in a single sentence that has followed the marriage ever since. At Clarence House, he said, it was very much his show. When they moved to Buckingham Palace, all that changed. The palace was not a home. It was an institution, a vast office staffed by men who had served the old king and the king before him, who had their own way of doing everything and no intention of letting an energetic outsider of 30 change it. Philip disliked the place from the start, and never entirely stopped disliking it. He found it cold, overstaffed, and run by others, a house in which he was the most prominent resident and, in every way that mattered to a man like him, powerless. The men who ran it are the quiet antagonists of this whole story, and they deserve to be seen clearly. They were the courtiers, the private secretaries and household officers of the old school, formed in the Edwardian age and devoted to a creed that one of the most senior of them summed up as private probity and public spectacle. Their manners were exquisite, and their power was real, and they regarded the Queen's husband with a wariness that never quite thawed. He had energy and ideas, and, in the words of the friend who watched it happen, get up and go. And none of it suited the establishment, not one bit. He was, that friend said, constantly being squashed, snubbed, ticked off, and rapped over the knuckles. It was, he added, intolerable. The clearest early test of who would win these battles came over the coronation itself, and it is worth telling because Philip won it. The question was whether the crowning should be televised, shown live to the ordinary people of the country, or kept as a private and sacred rite for the few thousand who could be fitted inside the abbey. The old guard was horrified by the idea. Churchill thought it wrong to let the cameras into so solemn a moment, as though it were a theatrical performance. The senior courtiers agreed with him, and the Queen Mother had her doubts. But Philip, who chaired the commission that planned the ceremony, pushed hard for the cameras, and the weight of public feeling pushed with him, and in the end, the doors were opened. The coronation was televised, and more than 27 million people watched their queen crowned in their own front rooms. It was Philip's victory, the modernizer's first real win against the men in grey, and it showed the shape of the part he would carve for himself out of the vacuum they had left him. And then there was the wound over the name. It opened within weeks of the accession, and it went deeper than any other injury of the marriage. An ambitious relative of Philip's had let it be known that, since a wife takes her husband's name, the royal house was now his house, the house of Mountbatten. The old Queen Mary was appalled. The Prime Minister of the day, Winston Churchill, and his cabinet, backed by the senior courtiers, moved at once to crush the idea. In the spring of 1952, it was formally declared that the royal house would remain the House of Windsor. Philip's own compromise, that it might be the House of Edinburgh, was swept aside. He had lost even the right to give his family his name. His reported reaction, set down years later by his biographer, is one of the rawest things ever recorded about him. He said he was nothing but a bloody amoeba, the only man in the country not allowed to give his name to his own children. It is a private remark, reported at second hand, and it should be heard as such. But it opens a window onto the size of the injury and onto the pressure building behind the calm public face. So consider the position of the man as it stood by the middle of the 1950s. He had given up the career he loved. He lived in a house he disliked, surrounded by men who disdained him. He walked a step behind his wife in public, and at the great ceremonies he knelt before her as her first subject and swore to become her liege man of life and limb. He had been denied his own name for his own children. He had, in his own dry and famous phrase, no constitutional existence at all. Constitutionally, he once said, "I do not exist." It was a joke. It was also the plain truth of his predicament, 4 words that held the whole of it. A lesser man might have sunk into idleness and resentment, and for a time, the danger was real. But Philip was not built for idleness, and instead, he did something that turned out to matter a great deal. He went looking for work the Constitution could not deny him. He took over the running of the royal estates. He fought and won the battle to have the coronation televised against the wishes of Churchill himself. He threw himself into science, industry, and the young. And in the very year this story turns on, 1956, he founded the award scheme that still carries his title, a program to test and stretch young people that would, within a generation, run in more than 100 countries and touch millions of lives. He was assembling, piece by piece, a role out of the vacuum the crown had left him. By the standards of a man with no constitutional existence, the portfolio he built was extraordinary. He took the presidencies and the patronages, hundreds of them, the scientific bodies and the industrial trusts and the sporting associations and the wildlife causes. He ran the great estates. He became the first member of the royal family to give a television interview, and the award scheme he founded in that very year would grow across the decades until it had enrolled more than 6 million young people in Britain alone and spread to more than 140 countries. It was a working life assembled from nothing by a man the Constitution said had no job to do. And it was, in its way, his answer to the palace that had tried to squash him. If they would not give him a role, he would build one they could not take away from him. It was into exactly this hunger, this restless search for a purpose of his own, that the invitation arrived. There was to be a great gathering of the world's youth at the bottom of the earth, in Australia, and the Queen had been asked to open it. She could not go. And so the question was put. Would the Duke of Edinburgh go in her place? And since he was going all that way, might he not carry the flag onward, into the loneliest corners of the Commonwealth, aboard the nation's magnificent new yacht? To the courtiers, it was a neat solution to a scheduling problem. To Philip, it was something else entirely. It was a mission that was genuinely his, on the sea, reaching places the Queen herself would never see. He said yes, and the machine began at once to arrange the story. Chapter 4. A mission of his own. When the invitation came to open a games at the bottom of the world, it was not a duty he dreaded, but a door he had been waiting for. The occasion was the Olympic Games of 1956, awarded to Melbourne, the first time in the history of the modern games that they had ever been held in the Southern Hemisphere. It was a matter of real pride for Australia and for the Commonwealth, and protocol asked that the sovereign, or her representative, declare them open. The Queen had accepted the invitation. The calendar of state then made it impossible for her to travel, and the obvious solution presented itself. Her husband would go in her name. But a journey to Melbourne and back is a long way to send a man for a single afternoon in a stadium, and the plan that took shape was far grander than one ceremony. The Duke would not simply fly out, open the games, and fly home. He would make of the journey a great looping voyage through the most remote and least visited territories the Crown still counted among its own, the specks of British land scattered across the bottom of the world, the islands that no reigning sovereign had ever seen, and in most cases never would. He would carry the flag to people who had never in their lives set eyes on a member of the royal family, and he would do it aboard the instrument that made the whole idea possible, the Royal Yacht Britannia. The ship deserves a moment, because she is the second story of this documentary and the stage on which 4 months of a marriage would be tested. Britannia had been commissioned only 2 years before, in 1954, the first royal yacht built in the new reign, a floating piece of the palace that could carry the monarchy to any coast on Earth. She was elegant, ocean-going, and built for exactly this kind of enterprise, the projection of the crown into waters too distant for any ordinary state visit. For a man who had lost his own ship 5 years earlier, the prospect of months aboard her, moving from ocean to ocean, must have stirred something that palace corridors never could. She was not his to command, but she was a deck under his feet and a horizon ahead of him. And that, for Philip, was close enough to the old life to be worth almost any price. Britannia was more than a ship. She was a working instrument of the crown, designed so that the monarchy could carry itself to any coast on Earth on its own sovereign ground. For the deck of the royal yacht was, in effect, a piece of Britain wherever in the world she happened to be. She had been commissioned in 1954, the first royal yacht of the new reign. In peace, she was the grandest ambassador the country possessed, a floating state apartment that could steam into a harbour on the far side of the world and receive presidents and governors and island chiefs in surroundings of quiet British splendour. For the tour of 1956, she was the one vessel that made the whole audacious plan possible, the only way to reach the scattered specks of empire that had no airfield and no harbour a great liner could enter. The itinerary was staggering in its reach. From the games at Melbourne, the yacht would turn and run south and east, out into the immense emptiness of the Southern Ocean. She would call at outposts most people in Britain could not have found on a map, the scattered islands of the Pacific, and then, turning for home the long way, the far-flung British possessions of the South Atlantic. She would cross the Antarctic Circle itself, carrying Philip further south than any member of the royal family had ever been. She would touch islands so remote that a ship called perhaps once or twice a year, and the arrival of the Queen's own husband was the event of a lifetime for every soul who lived there. By the time she came home, she would have logged more than 72,000 miles, and the Duke's own travelling, by yacht and by air, would come to more than 40,000. It was, by any measure, one of the most ambitious royal journeys ever attempted. The shape of it, laid out in numbers, is staggering even now. The Duke would leave in the October of 1956 and would not set foot in England again until the last week of February, the better part of 4 months away, while the yacht herself would be at sea on the Enterprise for close to 5. He would open a Games watched by the world, cross the Antarctic Circle where no member of his family had ever been, and call at islands thousands of miles from London. By the end of it, Britannia would have logged more than 72,000 miles of ocean, and the Duke's own travelling, by sea and by air together, would come to more than 40,000. No consort had ever undertaken anything remotely like it, and the very grandeur of the scheme was the thing that made it, at one and the same time, magnificent public service, and a 4-month hole torn in the middle of a marriage. And it would take him away from his wife and his children for the best part of 4 months. He would leave in October. He would not return until close to the end of February. He would be at sea for Christmas and for the New Year. His son would have a birthday without him. His daughter would pass the season without him. And the Queen would face the darkest and busiest months of the year, the Christmas broadcast, the endless boxes, the whole machinery of the reign, entirely alone. To the men arranging the story, none of this was a difficulty. It was, on the contrary, the very heart of the message. Here was a consort so devoted to the Commonwealth that he would give up his own Christmas, his own family, 4 months of his own life, to carry the crown to its furthest children. The absence was to be presented not as a cost, but as a virtue. There is no reason to doubt that the public purpose was real. The tour did genuine good. The remote islanders were not forgotten, the flag was shown, the Commonwealth was served. But it would be an incomplete telling that ignored the private truth running underneath. For the courtiers, the voyage solved a diary problem. For the Commonwealth, it was a gift. For Philip himself, it was something more personal and more complicated. A release, a return to the sea, a mission that belonged to him and no one else. And, whether he would ever have admitted it or not, 4 months of distance from a marriage and a household that had pressed on him hard for years. All of these things were true at once. That is the nature of the whole story. The public version and the private version were not rivals. They lived side by side, and the machine's task was simply to make sure the public only ever saw the first of them. There was a further irony in the timing, for 1956 was also the year Philip founded the award scheme that would carry his name to the young of the whole world. The same 12 months that saw him launch a lifelong project to give purpose to other people's children, saw him sail away from his own for a third of a year. The man was never idle, never content to sit still inside the gilded cage of the palace, and the tour fed the same restless appetite as the award and the estates and the endless patronages. It was work, and Philip needed work the way other men need rest. That the particular work on offer this time happened to carry him to the ends of the earth, away from the courtiers and the corridors, and, yes, away from the daily friction of the marriage, was a thing he would never have named aloud, and almost certainly felt all the same. So the arrangements were made, and the great ship was readied. In October of 1956, the Duke of Edinburgh said his farewells and went down to the sea. Somewhere in the record, half remembered, is the image this documentary began with, the Queen watching him go, the distance opening between them foot by foot as the ship pulled away. Whatever passed between them in that parting, no camera was permitted to keep it. What is certain is that the moment the yacht cleared the harbour, a clock began to run. 4 months, 2 oceans, and waiting at the far end of the winter, a scandal that not even the most silent palace in the world would be able to keep behind the wall. Chapter 5. The Flame and the Empty Chair. On the 22nd of November, he stood in a stadium at the bottom of the world and opened the games in his wife's name, and she was half a world away. The scene at the Melbourne cricket ground was one of pure ceremony and pure pride. The great oval was filled to the brim. The athletes of the world marched in behind their flags, and into the centre of it came the Duke of Edinburgh, in the naval uniform he wore more naturally than any other clothes he owned, to speak the words that declared the first Southern Games open. For Australia, it was a moment of arrival, proof that the young country could gather the world. For the man at the centre of it, it was the first great public act of a voyage that would carry him steadily further from everything he knew. There is a particular poignancy in that image, once you set it beside what was happening at home. The husband stood before a vast crowd of cheering strangers under the southern sun. The wife sat at a desk in a grey London autumn, working through the boxes, keeping the rain turning, raising two small children who were asking when their father would be back. The photographs from Melbourne show a confident, smiling consort at the height of his public powers. They do not show the empty chair beside the Queen, which no photograph was taken to record. The ceremony itself was a triumph of the new Commonwealth spirit, and the meaning of it set the public key for the whole voyage. Melbourne had waited years for this, and the city gave the Games everything it had. The great oval of the cricket ground was packed to its very limit when the Duke rose to speak the short formula that declared the Games open. For a young nation on the far rim of the world, it was a coming of age, the first time the modern Olympics had ever been held anywhere in the southern half of the globe, and the presence of the Queen's own husband to open them set the seal of the crown on the whole enterprise. Philip was in his element. He was easy with crowds, easy in uniform, easy with the blend of ceremony and sport, and the pictures that ran in every newspaper on earth showed a consort at the very height of his public powers. There was, to the watching world, nothing in those images but success. Here was the crown, carried halfway round the planet by a vigorous young prince, honouring a loyal dominion, lighting the Commonwealth's pride. The arranged story was working exactly as the men who built it had intended. What none of those photographs carried, because none was taken to carry it, was the plain domestic fact underneath the pageant. The prince who opened the Games in Melbourne had a wife and two young children on the other side of the world, and he had already been gone from them for the better part of 2 months, with more than 2 still to run. The public saw the triumph. The cost stayed home, unphotographed, in a grey London where a queen worked through her boxes alone and 2 small children marked the days on a calendar. From Melbourne, the ceremonial gave way to the sea, and the true character of the voyage began to reveal itself. This was not a tour of great cities. It was a long, deliberate reaching out to the ends of the earth. In the middle of December, the Duke came to New Zealand, flying into the airfield at Ohakea on the 11th and moving through the country at speed. Wellington and the hot springs of Rotorua, the towns and the crowds, all of it compressed into a handful of days. He broke away to call at Norfolk Island, a green speck in the Pacific, in the middle of the month, and rejoined Britannia at Christchurch. And from there, the yacht pressed on toward the Chatham Islands, further and further from any place a Londoner could picture. Each landfall took him deeper into distance, and each was reported home as duty done and the flag well shown. The pattern of the whole enterprise was set in those December weeks. Arrive, dazzle, depart. A day here, 2 days there, a landfall on some remote coast where the crowds had gathered and waited weeks for the sight of him, and then the anchor up and the horizon again. For the people ashore, it was the event of a lifetime. For the man aboard, it was a rhythm of ceaseless motion, always moving, always further out, the ship eating the miles between himself and home at a steady clip. There was no still centre to it, no pause, no week in one place where a man might sit and feel the absence of his family. There was only the next port, and the one after that, and the slow gathering of distance that would, by the turn of the year, put the whole width of the planet between a husband and a wife. And every mile of it widened the gap in the marriage that the machine was working so hard to describe as devotion. Then came Christmas, and with it, the single most revealing moment of the whole absence. The Queen's Christmas broadcast was, in those years, one of the fixed points of the national calendar, the sovereign speaking directly to her peoples across the Commonwealth on the afternoon of Christmas Day. In 1956, she delivered it alone, with her husband thousands of miles away at sea, and she chose to meet the fact head-on rather than hide it. She spoke of him directly. Of all the voices she had heard that afternoon, she said, None had given her and her children greater joy than that of her husband. And then the line that the machine could not have written better if it had tried. "If my husband cannot be at home on Christmas Day," she said, "I could not wish for a better reason than that he should be travelling in other parts of the Commonwealth." For the family, whatever the broadcast said, it was simply a Christmas without a father. The two children opened their presents with their mother and no Duke at the table. The Queen carried the day as she carried everything, with composure, and then went back to the boxes and the business of the reign. Somewhere far to the south, her husband spent the same hours at sea, on a heaving grey deck under a summer sun that felt entirely wrong for the season, thousands of miles from the warm rooms and the wireless, and the children counting his absence. The broadcast turned that separation into a virtue for the listening millions. It could not turn it into anything other than a separation for the four people who were living it. It was a masterstroke of the arranged story, and it was almost certainly sincere as well. And both of those things can be true. The Queen was defending the absence in her own voice to the whole listening world, turning a husband's 4-month departure into an act of Commonwealth service so admirable that no one could reasonably question it. To a country listening by its wireless sets, it settled the matter. The Duke was away because the Duke was serving. There was nothing more to see, and yet the very need to say it, to address the absence out loud in the most watched speech of the year, tells you that the absence was already being noticed, already being talked about, already becoming a thing that required an answer. The wall was still holding, but the Queen herself had just been enlisted to reinforce it, and that is not something a palace does when there is nothing to defend. While she spoke into the microphone in a warm room in England, her husband was running south into the coldest water on earth. The contrast could hardly have been sharper. The nation gathered around its firesides to hear its Queen. Her consort stood on a heaving deck under strange stars, weeks of ocean in every direction, further from home than he had ever been in his life. The voyage that had begun as a mission of his own was becoming something closer to an exile, self-chosen and honourable, but an exile all the same. And out ahead of him, in the empty grey waters below the circle, lay the loneliest passages of the whole journey, and beside him, through all of it, stood the one man aboard whose own life was quietly falling apart. Chapter 6. To the bottom of the world. From Melbourne the yacht turned south, and every mile she logged put more sea between a husband and a wife. This was the stretch of the voyage that made it famous, the part that carried the Duke of Edinburgh into waters no member of the royal family had ever entered. In January of 1957, Britannia crossed the Antarctic Circle. Philip became the first of his family ever to go so far south, into the region of pack ice and endless summer daylight and cold that bites through any coat. Photographs from those weeks show him muffled against the weather, gazing out at a white nothingness that must have felt like the very edge of the world. For a man who had spent his life on ships, it was the adventure of a lifetime. For a marriage measured in the distance between two people, it was the furthest point of all, the moment the gap could grow no wider. The crossing of the circle was a genuine feat, not a piece of theatre. In the January of 1957, Britannia pushed down into the ice-strewn waters of the far south, and the Duke of Edinburgh became the first member of the royal family in the long history of the Crown to cross the Antarctic Circle. There were no crowds to perform for down there, no ceremonies, no reporters filing copy, only the sea and the ice and the strange, unending daylight of the polar summer. Philip, the sailor who had lost his own ship, was in the one element that had ever truly been his, further from London and the palace and the whole apparatus of his caged life than he had ever been or would ever be again. For a man who had spent 5 years chafing in gilded rooms, It must have felt less like duty than like release, the widest breath he had drawn since he came ashore in 1951. The islands he touched in those weeks read like a roll call of the forgotten ends of the empire. There was the long haul through the Southern Ocean to the scattered British lands of the far South Atlantic. There was Tristan da Cunha, perhaps the most isolated inhabited island on the planet, a single volcanic cone with a tiny community clinging to it, where a ship called only rarely, and the sight of the Queen's own husband stepping ashore on the 17th of January was an event that would be told and retold for generations. There were the other specks of British land strung across that immense emptiness, places whose entire population might turn out to a soul for the arrival of the Royal Yacht. To each of them, the visit was overwhelming, the single greatest thing that had ever happened to the island. The Duke moved among them with the ease he always had with ordinary working people, the sailors and the farmers and the fishermen, the men whose world he understood far better than he understood the drawing rooms of London. There is something almost unbearably poignant in that gift for ordinary people, set against the marriage the voyage was straining. Among the fishermen of Tristan and the shepherds of the Falklands and the sailors of the fleet, Philip was liked and at ease, a plain-spoken man among plain-spoken men, far from the courtiers who disdained him. He gave those forgotten islanders the visit of their lives, and they gave him in return exactly the uncomplicated welcome the palace never had. The quiet tragedy of it is that the very qualities which made him such a success at the ends of the earth, the bluntness, the energy, the impatience with soft London manners, were the same qualities that grated inside Buckingham Palace and, at times, inside the marriage itself. He was a man who fitted everywhere except the one place his life had put him. And the further the yacht carried him from that place, the freer he seemed. Which is not a comfortable thing to notice about a husband and father 4 months gone from home. Set the scale of the journey against the scale of a life, and the numbers begin to tell their own story. By the time she came home, Britannia had logged more than 72,000 miles on the deployment. The Duke's own travelling, counting the flights and the side journeys as well as the sea miles, came to more than 40,000. He had crossed the Antarctic Circle. He had touched islands thousands of miles from London. He had been away by the time it was over for the best part of 4 months, and the full working life of the yacht on that single enterprise stretched close to 5. These are not the numbers of a weekend duty. They are the numbers of a genuine and prolonged removal from ordinary life, and the men who planned the tour knew exactly how long it would keep him gone when they planned it. And this is where the honest telling has to hold 2 truths at once. On the one hand, the voyage was real service, and Philip threw himself into it with the energy he brought to everything. He was not idling on a pleasure cruise. He was working, opening, inspecting, meeting, carrying the crown to people who would otherwise never have seen it, and doing it well. On the other hand, the very thing that made the voyage such good public relations, its extraordinary length and reach, was also what made it such a strain on the marriage and such a gift to the gossips. 4 months is a long time. A wife alone through a London winter, with 2 young children and the whole weight of the crown, while her husband sails from one glamorous horizon to the next, is a situation that writes its own rumours, whether or not there is a word of truth in them. The machine had built a story of devotion. It had also, without meaning to, built a stage on which a very different story could be performed. No consort in living memory had been away so long. A state visit lasted days. A tour ran to a few weeks at the most. 4 months was the stuff of a naval commission, not a royal engagement, and the sheer length of it was without precedent for the husband of a reigning queen. The palace had reasons for every leg of the journey, and the reasons were sound ones. but reasons are not the same as feelings. And out in the wider world, the feeling grew that something about this absence was strange. A young wife, a new queen, 2 small children, and a husband who chose to spend a third of a year at the bottom of the sea. It did not take a scandal to make people wonder. The length alone was enough. Put the arithmetic of the absence in a single frame, and the unease makes sense. The Duke had left in October and would not return until late February, the better part of 18 weeks away from his wife. He would spend Christmas at sea and the New Year at sea. His children, 7 and 6 years old, would pass the better part of a third of a year without a father in the house. The yacht would carry him across 2 great oceans and the frozen water between them, more than 72,000 miles of sea by the end of it. No amount of Commonwealth purpose could quite dissolve the plain domestic strangeness at the heart of the thing. A young husband and father choosing, or at least agreeing, to vanish over the horizon for a whole season while the world watched his wife carry on alone. Because absence, in the mind of the public, is a space, and a space demands to be filled. For most of the voyage, the space had been filled with the approved account, the Christmas broadcast, the pictures of the flag being shown at the ends of the earth. But out in the wider world, and especially in the foreign press that felt none of Fleet Street's careful deference, another account was beginning to take shape. Why, some began to ask, was the Queen's husband quite so willing to stay away quite so long? What kind of marriage sends a man to the bottom of the world for a third of a year? The questions were unfair. They were also, given the length of the absence, almost inevitable, and they were about to be handed a spark because the man standing at Philip's side through all these lonely weeks, his oldest friend and his private secretary, was carrying a private catastrophe that would light the whole thing up. Every long voyage has its constant companion, and Philip's was Michael Parker. How a routine tour turned into a scandal that shook the palace is a question that leads straight to that one man, to who he was, what he meant to Philip, and the world the two of them had shared in London long before Britannia ever put to sea. His story is the fuse, and it had already been lit. Chapter 7. The Friend Who Never Left His Side. On every deck, in every port, there stood the one man who had known him before any of it, and whose own life was quietly coming apart. Michael Parker was an Australian, born in Melbourne in the summer of 1920, and he had come into Philip's life the honest way, through the Navy and the war. The 2 young officers met in 1942, when both were serving at sea in the hard years of the Atlantic and the North Sea, Philip on one ship and Parker on another close by, and they became fast friends in the way that only men who have shared danger ever quite do. They were alike in temperament, quick, funny, irreverent, impatient with pomp, and the friendship outlasted the war that had made it. The bones of Parker's life explain the bond. He had been born in Melbourne in the summer of 1920, schooled there, and had gone to sea young, serving in both the Australian and the British navies through the hardest years of the war. He had been at the fierce fighting off Narvik in the icy waters of Norway. He had held his own commands and risen, like Philip, to the rank of lieutenant commander. The two met in 1942 when they were serving in the same waters, escorting the convoys that kept Britain fed and armed, and each recognized in the other the same restless, capable, irreverent spirit. They were young officers together in a war that killed a great many young officers, and the friendships forged in that furnace tended to hold. Theirs held for the best part of 60 years. When Philip married and needed men about him he could trust, he turned to Parker. The Australian joined his household, at first in a part-time way, and then, from the accession in 1952, as his full-time private secretary, the man who ran his working life. For the best part of a decade, Parker was closer to Philip than almost anyone outside the marriage itself. He organized the days, smoothed the path, shared the jokes, and stood as a buffer between the restless Duke and the disapproving courtiers who surrounded him. It was Parker who remembered Philip telling him at the very beginning that his job, first and second and last, was never to let the Queen down. And it was Parker who saw, more clearly than any outsider, how hard the palace years pressed on his friend, how constantly he was squashed and snubbed and rapped over the knuckles by the men in grey. When Philip sailed for the bottom of the world in 1956, it was Parker who sailed with him. Where the Duke went, his old friend went too. The job Parker did is the job that would destroy his marriage. A private secretary to a man like Philip was never truly off duty. He arranged the days and answered the letters and smoothed the endless small collisions between the restless Duke and the disapproving household. He travelled when the Duke travelled, which was constantly, and he was expected to drop everything at any hour when he was needed. It was a life lived at another man's side, and it left very little of Parker over for a home of his own. Eileen Parker would one day write a memoir of those years, whose very title caught the whole bitter truth of it, a book she called Step Aside for Royalty. For the wife of a royal servant, stepping aside was the entire arrangement. The crown came first. The marriage came a distant second. And a marriage that always comes second will, in the end, come apart. None of which was Philip's doing exactly, and yet it flowed from him. The Duke did not order his friend to neglect his home. He simply needed him, constantly and without much thought for the cost, in the way that powerful men lean on the people who serve them, and Parker gave what was asked because he was loyal and because he loved the life. The two of them, master and man, were bound by a genuine affection that made the whole arrangement feel like friendship rather than service, and for years that disguised how heavily it all rested on Parker's own marriage. It was only when that marriage finally gave way, at the far end of the longest voyage of all, that the true price of the friendship came due, and it came due at the worst possible moment for both of them. The two men also shared a world in London, and it is a world that matters to this story, because it is the raw material from which the coming scandal would be built. In Soho, at a fish restaurant called Wheeler's, there met a weekly luncheon club of men, founded by a fashionable society photographer, that gathered every Thursday and took its name from the day. It was a gathering of artists and actors and writers and photographers, and the odd, charming rogue, a place for clever men to eat oysters, drink well, and talk without the weight of their public selves. Philip went to it. Parker went with him. It was, by the accounts of the men who belonged, a high-spirited boys' luncheon, and nothing more sinister than that. But among its wider circle was an osteopath and man about town whose name would, a few years later, become one of the most notorious in Britain when he stood at the centre of a scandal that nearly brought down a government. The club would gather to itself, over time, a reputation for something wilder than oysters, a reputation Parker himself would dismiss flatly as absolute rubbish. The founder of the club was a fashionable photographer who moved easily between the palace and the demi-monde, a man who knew every actor, artist and chancer in Soho. Around his table on a Thursday might sit painters and comedians and writers and naval officers and the occasional figure whose respectability was more decorative than real. It was, in the London of its day, a glamorous and faintly dangerous place to be seen, the kind of room where a clever, restless prince, starved of ordinary male company by the stiff formality of his life, could relax among men who treated him as one of themselves. There was nothing criminal in it, and on any honest reading of the evidence, nothing adulterous. But it was worldly, and it was male, and it was Soho. And to a hostile imagination, those three facts were enough to build almost anything upon. Here is the thing to understand about that reputation. It was almost entirely smoke. There is no credible evidence that the Thursday Club was anything more than what its members said it was, a lively lunch. But it existed, and it was real, and it placed the Queen's husband in a set of glamorous, worldly, faintly raffish men in the heart of Soho. And when a rumour needed somewhere to root itself, when the foreign press went looking for a way to give shape to the whispers about a long royal absence, the club was exactly the kind of true detail out of which a false story could be grown. A married prince, an all-male luncheon in Soho, a photographer, a fast crowd. None of it proved anything. All of it could be arranged by a hostile pen into an insinuation. The club was the tinder. Parker's private life was about to become the match. For while Parker sailed at Philip's side through the Pacific and the Antarctic, his marriage in London was ending. His wife had had enough of the endless absences, of the royal service that took her husband away for months at a time, of a marriage conducted around the demands of another man's life. The very devotion that made Parker such a good private secretary, the readiness to drop everything and follow the Duke to the ends of the earth, had hollowed out his own home. And now, with the two men at the furthest point of their long voyage, unreachable and unaware, the wife he had left behind was preparing to act. When she did, the blow would land not only on Parker, but through him, on the Duke he served, and the Queen the Duke had sworn never to let down. The scandal that would test the palace to its limits did not begin with Philip at all. It began with a courtier's broken marriage, and it was about to break wide open. Chapter 8. The marriage the cameras never caught. 2 years before the voyage, a film crew waiting to capture a happy royal couple caught something else entirely, and the reel was destroyed before it could be seen. The story of that reel is worth telling in full, because it is the single hardest piece of evidence in this whole documentary, the one moment when the private reality of the marriage was very nearly caught on film, and it shows exactly what the machine existed to hide. It also shows something more important. It shows that the strain in this marriage was real, documented, and years old, which is precisely why a rumour about a rift, when it came, was so dangerous. There was, under the balcony image, something genuine to protect. It happened in 1954, during the long Commonwealth tour that followed the coronation, at a place called the O'Shanassy Reservoir in the state of Victoria, in Australia. The royal couple had stopped there for a rest, and a film unit had been sent ahead to capture some gentle, homely footage of the Queen and the Duke at ease, the kind of warm domestic pictures the public loved. What the crew filmed instead was a marriage with the lid off. Philip came storming out of the chalet, by the accounts that survive, with objects flying after him. The Queen came out behind him, and in front of the astonished crew, she hurled a tennis racket and then a pair of shoes at her husband, before chasing him and hauling him back inside. A moment later, she emerged, composed, and apologized to the crew for what she called the little interlude, remarking that these things happen in every marriage, and asking, with perfect calm, what they would like her to do next. What happened to that film tells you everything about the world these people lived in. The Queen's press secretary demanded the reel. This could not, he made clear, be allowed to exist. The footage was handed over, and the sound man exposed it to the light, destroying it, so that the images could never be seen. It does not survive. It cannot be shown. It can only be described at second hand by the people who were there and later spoke of it. And what caused the row in the first place was never established, and never will be. The most that the sober commentators will say is that the couple were exhausted, near the end of a grueling months-long tour, and that what the crew witnessed was the ordinary friction of a passionate marriage under extraordinary pressure, not the symptom of a marriage failing. That destroyed reel is the single most telling object in the whole story, precisely because it does not exist. Think of what it would be worth to a newspaper, then or now, film of the Queen throwing a tennis racket at her husband. Think of how completely the machine moved to make sure no one would ever see it. A press secretary demanded the film. A sound man pulled it from the camera and exposed it to the light, and the images died in his hands. There was no argument, no negotiation, no thought that the public might have a claim on it. The reflex was total and instant. Whatever the Crown did not wish to be seen simply ceased to exist, wiped out at the source, and the country was left with the balcony version and nothing else. The winter of 1956 would be the moment that Reflex met a story it could not reach, an American headline it could not pull from a camera and burn. That distinction is the beating heart of this entire story, so it is worth being precise about it. The evidence that the marriage had strain in it is overwhelming and well attested. There was the thrown racket at the reservoir. There was the wound over the name, the bloody amoeba, and the children he could not give his name to. There was the temper in the car, where by the account of one who knew them, he could call his wife a fool and tell her she was talking rubbish and drive fast enough to frighten her, though the same witnesses always add that she gave every bit of it back and did not seem to mind. One story in particular has survived, told by a man close to the family. Philip was driving, too fast as usual, and his wife kept up a running commentary of alarm from the passenger seat, sucking in her breath at the corners. He bore it for a while and then told her, flatly, that if she did it once more, he would put her out of the car and let her walk. She stopped. She said nothing more for the rest of the journey. It is a small domestic scene, the kind that plays out in 100,000 marriages, and that is exactly its value. Strip away the crown and the medals and the palace, and underneath is a recognizable couple, a blunt husband and a sharp wife, the ordinary friction of two strong people harnessed together for the whole of their lives. And there was the older, deeper injury that no reservoir and no fast car could match, the wound over the family name. For 8 years, Philip carried the grievance of a man who had been told he could not give his own name to his own children, that the house would be his wife's house, and his sons and daughters would bear her family's name, and not his. To a proud man who had already surrendered his career and his country to marry her, it was the final subtraction, the one that struck at his sense of himself as a husband and a father. His bitter private word for it, set down long afterward by his biographer, was that he felt like nothing but an amoeba, the only man in the land forbidden his own name. That is not the complaint of a contented man. It is the evidence of real and lasting strain, the kind the machine worked hardest of all to keep from view. There was the blunt, difficult, self-reliant man raised without a home of his own, forever chafing against a role that denied him one. All of that is documented. All of that is real. And none of it, on the evidence, adds up to a marriage that was breaking. It adds up to a marriage that was hard and passionate and genuine and permanent. The people who stood closest to it are unanimous on this point, and their word is worth more than any rumour. The Queen's own private secretary said that Philip was the only man in the world who treated the Queen simply as another human being, and he meant it as the highest kind of praise, because everyone else in her life treated her as an institution. Parker said Philip's whole purpose was never to let her down. Even the servants caught the warmth of it. One recalled the Queen, in her middle 30s, shrieking with laughter and calling out for Philip to stop as he chased her through a room, the two of them behaving for a moment like any couple anywhere. This was not a cold marriage. It was a hot one, in every sense, and the heat cut both ways. But heat can be made to look like fire by anyone who wants it to, and that is the danger the winter of 1956 was about to expose. A long absence, a famous temper, a raffish club in Soho, a private life that had already given the machine one reel it had to burn. All the elements were in place, and all it would take to bring them together into a public conflagration was a single spark from an unexpected direction. That spark was not lit by Philip, and it was not lit by any woman the papers would later name. It was lit by a wife at home, at the end of her patience, who picked up the threads of her own broken marriage and, without ever intending to, set the whole royal household alight. Her name was Eileen Parker, and while her husband sailed under Antarctic stars, she had decided that she had waited long enough. Chapter 9. A Wife Decides at Home. While the two men sailed under Antarctic stars, a woman in London made a decision that would reach all the way to the palace. Eileen Parker had been married to Michael for years, and for years she had watched the royal service she had not chosen eat her marriage alive. Her husband belonged, in practice, to the Duke of Edinburgh. When the Duke needed him, he went. And the Duke needed him constantly, at all hours, for days and weeks, and now for months on end. A private secretary to a restless prince is never off duty, and the cost of that devotion was not paid by the prince. It was paid at home, by the wife who sat through the empty evenings and the cancelled plans and the long absences, raising a family around the gap where a husband should have been. The 4-month voyage was the final weight on a marriage already close to breaking. With Michael gone to the far side of the world, unreachable, following another man across the oceans while his own home stood empty, Eileen reached the end of what she could bear. In the early days of February 1957, she made her decision public. She let it be known that the marriage was over, that she and Michael were to separate. In time, she would seek a divorce, and the grounds she would cite were adultery. It was a private tragedy of the most ordinary kind, a marriage worn away by absence and neglect, the sort of thing that happened in 10,000 homes every year and made news in none of them. Except that this marriage was not ordinary, because the absent husband was the right hand of the Queen's own consort, and that single fact turned a domestic sorrow into a threat to the crown. Here the machinery of the palace, and the reason it existed, comes sharply into view. A royal household in that era could not afford to be touched by the divorce courts. Divorce still carried a heavy public stain, heavy enough that its mere proximity to the sovereign was treated as a danger to be contained at almost any cost. And now a divorce was breaking out at the very heart of the Duke's own staff, with the Duke thousands of miles away and the whole affair certain to draw the eyes of the press. The threat was not that anyone believed the Duke himself had done wrong. The threat was contamination, the fear that the scandal of the servant would splash upward onto the master, that the papers would draw a line, however unfair, from the private secretary's broken marriage to the prince he served and the queen the prince had married. What made the timing so cruel and so dangerous was that the two men at the centre of it could do nothing. They were at the far end of the earth, at sea, effectively beyond reach, when the decision was taken and the news broke in London. Michael Parker could not rush home to his wife, could not sit down with her, could not slow the machinery that was already turning. He would learn that his marriage had ended not across a kitchen table, but by signal, at sea, thousands of miles from the woman who had ended it. And Philip could do nothing but watch his oldest friend absorb the blow and know, with a sinking certainty, that the scandal breaking around Parker would not stop at Parker. The very distance that had carried them both toward freedom had also carried them beyond any power to shape what was happening at home. It is worth pausing on the cruelty buried in the situation, because it defines the whole moral shape of the story. Eileen Parker had done nothing wrong. She was the injured party in her own marriage, a woman worn down by years of coming second to the crown. Her husband had given the best of himself to the royal service, and the price of that service had been his own home. And yet, when the reckoning came, it was not the crown that would apologize to the Parkers for what its demands had cost them. It was the Parkers who would be required to remove themselves, quietly and quickly, so that no shadow of their private grief should fall on the palace. The household protected itself first. The people who had served it were expected to absorb the damage and disappear. That is how the machine worked, and the coming days would show it working with a cold and practiced efficiency. There is a further, colder detail that the record preserves. Eileen Parker, having made her decision, did not run to the popular press to sell her grievance, though a wife in her position could have named a fortune for the story of life inside the Duke's household. She kept her dignity through the storm, as her husband kept his. Years later, she set down her side of it in a book of quiet, wounded honesty, and the picture it painted was not one of scandal, but of neglect, of a marriage slowly starved by the demands of a crown that took everything and gave nothing back. She had not set out to damage anyone. She had simply reached the end of what a woman could be asked to bear, and asked at last to be let go. That her private release should have become a public emergency was the doing of the institution, and not of her. Word of the crisis moved through the household with the speed such things always move. In an institution built on the management of appearances, a divorce inside the Duke's own office was a fire alarm, and the senior men fell at once to the work they knew best, the containment of damage. There would be no public reflection on what the royal service had cost the Parkers, no admission that the crown had helped to break the marriage it now found so inconvenient. There would only be the swift, practiced motion of cutting the danger away. The machine had burned a reel of film to protect the marriage 2 years before. Now it would sacrifice a friendship to protect it again. The instinct was the same. Only the price had changed. And the price, this time, would be paid by a friend and not by a strip of film. That is the quiet horror at the centre of the Parker affair, the thing that lifts it above ordinary palace housekeeping. A reel of celluloid feels nothing when it burns. Michael Parker was a living man, with a ruined marriage and a decade of loyal service behind him. And the machine's answer to his misfortune was to remove him, swiftly and cleanly, before his private grief could inconvenience the crown. There was no malice in it. There was something colder than malice, the pure institutional reflex of an organism protecting itself, indifferent to the human being caught in the gears. Eileen Parker had lost her husband to the crown. Now Michael Parker would lose his place to it as well. The crown itself lost nothing at all. For now, the essential thing was speed and distance. The scandal had to be cut away from the royal household before it could spread, and it had to be done before the press could fasten the story to the Duke. Word of the crisis was already racing across the oceans toward Britannia, toward the two friends at the bottom of the world who did not yet know that one of their marriages had just ended in the London papers. The yacht was turning for home now, running north up the length of 2 oceans toward Gibraltar and the waiting reporters and the end of the long voyage. And somewhere on that northward passage, Michael Parker learned that his marriage was over and that his time at the Duke's side was over with it. What he chose to do about it, and how the palace arranged his going, is the next turn of the story, and it happened on a grey day on the Rock of Gibraltar. Chapter 10. Farewell at Gibraltar. When Britannia reached Gibraltar, one of the two friends walked down the gangway for the last time as the Duke's man. The great voyage was nearly done. The yacht had come all the way up from the Southern Ocean, and at Gibraltar the Duke was to leave her and fly the last stretch home. But before that homecoming there was an amputation to perform, and it was performed on the Rock. Michael Parker resigned. He gave up his post as the Duke's private secretary, the job that had been his life for a decade. And he did it on the 6th of February 1957, so that the divorce breaking around him would fall on a private citizen and not on a member of the royal household. The logic was as brutal as it was clear. As long as Parker was the Duke's private secretary, his divorce was the palace's divorce, a scandal attached to the crown. The moment he ceased to be the Duke's private secretary, his divorce was his own private misfortune, and the household was clean. So he resigned, at once, at the first port that offered, before the reporters could gather in force. It was the correct move by the cold arithmetic of the palace, and it was a small human tragedy in its own right, the sacrifice of a loyal friend on the altar of the institution's reputation. Parker had followed Philip to the ends of the earth. He had served without stint, and his reward, when his own life fell apart, was to be quietly cut loose so that the splash would not reach his master. There survives from that day at Gibraltar a photograph, and it is one of the quietly devastating images of the whole reign. It shows the two men together, the Duke and his private secretary, at the moment their long partnership ended. Two friends who had met as young officers in the war, who had shared a decade of the strangest life either could have imagined, who had just sailed together to the bottom of the world and back, standing side by side for the last time in that role before they said their goodbyes and went their separate ways. There is no drama in the picture. There is only the ordinary sadness of an ending. Two men who liked each other very much, parting because the machine required it. Whatever was said between them that day was never recorded. The photograph is all that is left, and it is enough. Gibraltar was a fitting place for the parting, when you think about it. The great grey rock at the mouth of the Mediterranean, the gateway between the wider ocean and the narrow sea of home. Philip would leave the yacht here and fly the last leg to his wife. Parker would leave the Duke's service here and make his own way back to a life in ruins. The voyage that had bound the two friends together for 4 months at the ends of the earth was ending, and it was ending with one of them stepping off toward a reunion and the other stepping off toward a divorce. They had sailed to the bottom of the world, side by side. They came back to find that the world they had left behind had moved, in their absence, to pull them apart. For Philip, watching his oldest friend cut adrift must have been its own private wound, coming as it did at the end of the one long adventure that had felt like his old life given back to him. The two of them had shared everything for 4 months, the ceremonies and the ice and the empty islands, the jokes on the bridge and the long watches at sea. Parker was the last man aboard who had known Philip before the crown, who treated him as a friend and not as an institution. And now, at journey's end, the machine reached out and took even him away, quietly and completely, as it had taken so much else from the Duke over the years. Philip sailed on toward his wife and his reunion. His friend stepped off toward disgrace, and the Duke, who could command almost nothing in his gilded life, could not command this either. He could only watch it happen. Parker himself behaved throughout with a dignity that does him great credit, and it is worth marking what became of him, because the story too often forgets its wounded. He carried the scandal without complaint. He never traded on his years at the Duke's side, never sold the secrets he must have held, never said a bitter word in public about the institution that had cut him loose. He rebuilt his life far from the palace, working first for a great aircraft company and then for one of the largest advertising firms in the world. And in time, he went home to Australia, where he had been born. His place at the Duke's side was taken by a new private secretary, and the household closed over the gap. Decades later, His own country made him a member of the Order of Australia in recognition of his service. He died in Melbourne, an old man of 81, in the last days of the year 2001, having kept faith to the very end with the friend he had served. The friendship, it seems, survived the parting at Gibraltar. It was only the job that ended there. The coldness of the arithmetic deserves to be named plainly, because it is the whole method of the palace in a single act. Parker had done nothing that touched the Duke. His marriage was his own, his troubles were his own, and no one seriously believed the Duke was mixed up in them. But the palace did not deal in what was true so much as in what could be printed, and what could be printed was that the Duke's right-hand man was being divorced for adultery while the two of them sailed the world together. That sentence, once a newspaper set it in type, would drag the Duke into the frame whether or not he belonged there. So the man had to go at once, before the sentence could be written, and the going had to look like an ordinary resignation rather than a household in a panic. It was managed with the smoothness of long practice. And it very nearly worked. Very nearly, but not quite. And the reason it failed is a lesson in the limits of control. The very speed and neatness of Parker's departure, the sudden resignation at the first port, the sense of a household moving fast to tidy something away, was itself the kind of thing that made a sharp reporter look twice. Silence can be louder than speech. A private secretary who leaves quietly, in the ordinary way, stirs no comment. A private secretary hurried off the Royal Yacht at Gibraltar in the middle of a divorce, while his master stays abroad, is a story with a shape, and shapes draw the eye. In trying so hard to make the exit look ordinary, the machine had made it look like the opposite, and across the Atlantic, a reporter was already reaching for her pen. But cutting Parker loose did not kill the story. It could not, because the story had already slipped the leash. Even as the Duke prepared to fly home from Gibraltar to a reunion with his wife, the whispers that had been gathering all through the long absence were curdling into something harder and more dangerous. The very speed of Parker's resignation, the abruptness of it, the sense that the palace was moving fast to contain something, was itself the kind of thing that made reporters lean forward. Why the sudden departure? Why now, at Gibraltar, in such haste? What exactly was being contained? In Britain, the deferential press held its fire, but across the Atlantic, in a country that felt no loyalty to the British Crown and no obligation to look away, a reporter in a London office was about to take the loose threads of the absence and the resignation and the raffish rumours and weave them into the single most explosive sentence written about the marriage in its entire history. The spark had crossed the ocean, and it was about to come back as fire. Chapter 11. Rift over a party girl. 2 days later, a woman in a London newsroom filed a story that would cross an ocean and set the whole world talking. Her name was Joan Graham, and she was the London correspondent of an American newspaper, the Baltimore Sun. On the 8th of February 1957, 2 days after Parker's resignation at Gibraltar, she filed a report that gathered up everything the deferential British press had been too careful to print, and said it plainly, in the boldest possible terms. The headline was a detonation. It spoke of a rift between the Queen and the Duke, and it hung that rift on a phrase that would race around the planet within hours. A party girl. The story did what no British paper had dared to do. It took the long absence, the 4 months at sea, the sense that the Duke was in no hurry to come home, and it joined those facts to the raffish half-world of the Thursday Club and the Society photographers, and it insinuated a reason. It reported that café society, the fashionable talking classes of London, were openly discussing a rift in the royal marriage. It tied that talk to a woman the Duke was said to have met at a society photographer's flat in the West End, and it painted a picture, all suggestion and no proof, of a marriage in trouble and a husband who had stayed away at the far end of the earth because there was trouble to stay away from. Not one hard fact in it could be stood up. Every element of it was insinuation, the artful arrangement of true small details, a real absence, a real club, a real resignation, into a false, large conclusion. The anatomy of the thing is a masterclass in how a lie is built out of truths. Take a real fact, that the Duke had been away for 4 months. Take a second real fact, that he moved, in London, among a fast and glamorous set at a Soho luncheon club. Take a third, that his private secretary had just been divorced for adultery and hurried off the Royal Yacht at the first port. Each of those facts was true, and each, on its own, was innocent. But set them side by side, add a knowing hint about a woman met at a photographer's flat, and let the reader's own imagination do the rest. And a scandal has been manufactured without a single statement that could be taken to court. That is how the party girl story worked. It never quite accused. It merely arranged, and left the conclusion hanging in the air where every reader would reach up and take it. But it did not need to be true to be devastating. It only needed to be printed, and once it was printed in America, it was beyond anyone's control. The wire services picked it up, and the wire services carried it everywhere. Within days, the story was in newspapers around the world. The whispers of London's dinner tables turned into black headlines on 3 continents. The speed of it was the frightening part. In an earlier age, a London rumour might have stayed a London rumour, murmured over dinner and never set in type. But this story had been filed to America, and once it appeared in American newsprint, it was fair game everywhere, reprinted and rewritten and cabled around the globe within days. The British papers, which had held their tongues out of long habit and careful deference, now found the very story they had declined to print being read by their own readers under foreign datelines. The wall of silence that Fleet Street had helped the palace to build was worth nothing against a headline in Baltimore. The rumour had gone round the world before the truth had got its boots on, and there was no calling it back. The genie was out. The very thing the palace machine had spent the whole reign preventing, a public, printed suggestion that the sovereign's marriage was in crisis, had happened. And it had happened at the worst possible moment, with the Duke still abroad and the Parker divorce fresh in every reporter's notebook. The absence that had been sold as devotion was now being read, by millions, as flight. The empty chair at the Queen's Christmas had been given a sinister explanation. It is important to be clear and fair about the substance, because this documentary will not do to Philip what that newspaper did. There was no party girl. No affair was ever proven, then or in all the decades since. The names that gossip would attach to Philip over the years, an actress here, a family friend there, were never once substantiated, and the most serious biographers, including the very woman whose work was later blamed for spreading the innuendo, came in the end to dismiss the whole thing as nonsense. The names that gossip pinned to him over the decades are few, and always the same, and every one of them dissolves on contact with the evidence. There was a celebrated actress, linked to him by whispers after they were seen in a nightclub party, who denied any affair firmly and consistently to the end of her long life. There was a family friend from his continental relations, a singer, whose son became the subject of the ugliest rumour of all, a claim of secret fatherhood that the son himself would publicly and flatly deny. Not one of these tales was ever supported by a shred of proof. They were the ordinary barnacles that fasten themselves to any glamorous public man, and they would have sunk without trace long ago had the subject been anyone less interesting than the husband of the Queen. But interesting he was, and that was his misfortune. A dull consort would have been left alone. Philip was handsome, quick, glamorous, foreign-born, a war hero with a raffish set of friends and a taste for plain speaking. And men like that draw rumour the way a mast draws lightning. The party girl story of 1957 was only the first and loudest of a lifetime of whispers, and like all the rest, it fastened onto the interesting surface of the man and mistook it for the truth beneath. He gave the gossips a great deal to work with, and, on the evidence of a lifetime, nothing whatever to prove. Philip himself, years later, gave the flat, unanswerable reply of a man who had lived his entire adult life inside a goldfish bowl. For 40 years, he pointed out, he had never been able to move anywhere without a policeman at his side. How on earth, he asked, could he possibly have got away with anything? The rumour was smoke. But smoke, printed in 100 newspapers, looks a great deal like fire to a frightened institution. And the institution was frightened. This was the nightmare the whole silent machine had been built to prevent, and now it had arrived in full. A story of a royal rift, naming a party girl, running on the wires across the world, with the Duke absent and unable to be seen at his wife's side, and the deferential wall of the British press starting, here and there, to crack under the pressure of a story that everyone had now read. Something had to be done, and every instinct of the palace, every rule it had lived by for 100 years, screamed against doing the one thing that might work. Because the only way to kill a story of this size was to break the silence and answer it, and answering was the one thing this palace never, ever did. The men who ran the machine now faced a decision without precedent, and how they made it is the climax of the whole story. Chapter 12. The palace breaks its silence. For 100 years, the answer to every question about the marriage of a sovereign had been silence, and now the silence broke. To feel the full weight of the decision now facing the palace, you have to understand the man whose job it was to speak, and the creed he had spent his career serving. The Queen's press secretary in those years was a naval officer of the old school, Commander Richard Colville, and he was, by universal account, the least forthcoming press officer in the history of the British monarchy. Fleet Street had a nickname for him. They called him the Abominable No Man, because his answer to almost every request was no. One of the great biographers of the Queen described him as an unbending former sailor who treated the press with a mixture of distrust and lordly contempt, a man who wielded an extraordinary negative power, the power to refuse, to withhold, to say nothing and keep saying it. And for years it had worked, because the press had agreed to let it work. The newspapers of that era, still shaped by the deference of the war and the long habit of treating the royal family as very nearly sacred, mostly judged that their readers wanted the crown shown warm and comfortable and reassuring, and not otherwise. Editors did not go digging into royal marriages. Reporters did not shout questions across a rope line. The unwritten bargain held that the palace would provide the pageant, and the press would decline to look behind it. And for the most part, both sides kept their half of it. It was a cosy arrangement, and it had spared the monarchy 100 embarrassments, and it depended entirely on everyone agreeing to play. The one thing it could not survive was a player who had never signed up to the rules, and that is precisely what an American newspaper was. And so, the bargain that had shielded the crown for a generation broke down at its weakest joint. Colville and his colleagues could lean on a British editor, could call in a favour, could remind Fleet Street of its duty and its deference. They had no such hold on a correspondent filing to Baltimore. The story they most needed to suppress had appeared in the one place their power did not reach, and from there it had come flooding back into Britain through the open door of the foreign dateline. The machine of silence so effective for so long, discovered in a single week that it had been built for a world that no longer existed. A world in which the British press was the only press that counted. Colville was the human embodiment of the creed that ruled the palace, the 4 words that were the whole philosophy of the mid-century monarchy. Never complain, never explain. The theory behind it was simple, and for a long time, effective. The crown drew its mystery and its dignity from its distance. It did not argue with newspapers, did not deny stories, did not descend into the daily scramble of claim and counterclaim, because to do so was to step down off the pedestal and become just another public figure trading blows in the press. Silence was strength. Silence kept the mystery intact. And a largely deferential British press, still carrying the habits of wartime respect, had mostly gone along with it, judging that its readers wanted their royal family warm and comfortable and reassuring, not exposed. For years, the wall of silence had held because everyone inside and out had agreed to let it hold. Now the American press had broken the agreement, and the wall was failing, and the men of the palace faced a decision that cut against every instinct they possessed. They could hold to the creed, say nothing, and let the rift story run and run, gathering force with every day the Duke stayed away and every paper that reprinted it, until the silence itself began to look like confirmation. Or they could do the unthinkable. They could break 100 years of practice, step down off the pedestal, and issue a public denial, and in doing so admit that the story had grown so large that even this palace could no longer afford to ignore it. Either path carried danger. Silence risked letting the lie become accepted truth. Speech risked dignifying the lie by answering it, and confirming that the marriage was a fit subject for public debate. There was no safe choice. There was only the least bad one. It is hard, now, to feel how enormous that choice was, because the modern palace comments and denies and clarifies all the time. In 1957, it had not done so in living memory. To issue a denial was to concede that the story existed, that it mattered, that the marriage of the Queen was a thing the palace would stoop to discuss in public. It was to step, for the first time, into the ring. The men who took the decision were the most cautious in the kingdom, formed in a tradition that prized silence above almost every other virtue, and they were being asked to break that tradition in order to save it. Whatever they chose, they were making history, and they knew it. The wall had held for 100 years. They were the men who would decide whether it came down. They chose to speak. In the days after the story broke, on or about the 11th of February 1957, the palace did the thing it never did. Through Commander Colville, the man whose whole career had been the art of saying nothing, it issued a flat, public, unmistakable denial. It was quite untrue, the statement said, that there was any rift between the Queen and the Duke. The words were spare and absolute, and in some tellings the denial went further still, with the blunt addition that the story was, quite simply, a lie. After 100 years of never complaining and never explaining, the most silent institution in Britain had complained and explained in a single sentence, and the whole world knew it had. The significance of that sentence is almost impossible to overstate, and it is the true climax of this story, larger even than the rumour that provoked it. The palace measured the danger of a story by whether it would answer it, and its answer was almost always silence. That it broke that silence here, that it judged this particular story worth the unprecedented cost of a public denial, is the surest possible measure of how far the thing had run and how frightened the institution had become. The denial was not a sign of weakness in the marriage. It was a sign of strength in the panic, proof of how seriously the machine took the threat, not to the marriage itself, but to the image of the marriage. And notice, with care, exactly what the palace chose to deny. It did not descend into the gutter to argue about a party girl, a woman it could not disprove and would not name. It denied a rift. It denied that the marriage was in trouble, which was the one thing the household could speak to with authority, because the household was close enough to know. The men behind the wall were not defending Philip against a specific accusation they could not test. They were defending the marriage itself, and they were telling the plain truth about it, which is why they were willing, this once, to break the silence of a century to say it. The husband was still at sea. The denial had been made. All that remained was for the two of them to be seen, at last, standing side by side, and the world was waiting to watch it happen. Chapter 13. Reunion at Lisbon. Rather than wait for him to come home, the Queen flew out to meet him, and the world watched to see how they would stand together. It was a shrewd move as well as a loving one, and it is a mark of how the crisis had focused minds that the reunion was staged where the cameras could see it. The Duke was due to join his wife for a state visit to Portugal, and so it was arranged that they would come together in Lisbon in the full light of the world's press on the 16th of February 1957, only days after the palace had issued its denial. The message of the meeting was to be plain and visual and undeniable. Here they are, together, happy. The rift is a lie, and here is the proof of it, in the flesh, before your eyes. The decision to go to him, rather than to wait for him to come home, was itself a piece of quiet strategy. Had the Queen stayed in London and let her husband arrive alone, the cameras would have caught him coming down the aircraft steps by himself, a solitary figure returning under a cloud, and every photograph would have seemed to confirm the whispers. By flying out to meet him, she rewrote the picture at a stroke. The story the world would see was no longer a husband slinking home to face the music. It was a wife crossing a continent to throw her arms around the man she loved. In the arithmetic of images, that was worth more than any statement Colville could ever draft. And the Queen, who had grown up inside the machine that made such images, understood the arithmetic to perfection. The best remembered story of that reunion is a piece of pure comedy, and it has become one of the treasured anecdotes of the marriage, though it should be told for what it is, a charming tale from his biographer rather than a matter of solemn record. Philip had grown a beard during his long weeks at sea, a full growth that changed his face. The Queen, so the story goes, decided to meet the returning sailor in the same spirit, and when he boarded the royal aircraft to greet her, he found the Queen and her entire party waiting for him wearing false ginger beards, a whole row of solemn courtiers and ladies in waiting, and the sovereign herself, all sporting comic whiskers to tease the bearded traveller home. Whether it happened exactly so, no one can now be sure. But observers did note, as the couple came out together before the cameras, a smudge of lipstick on the Duke's cheek, the small, unstaged detail that did more to answer the rift story than any official denial ever could. That, in the end, was the point of Lisbon. The denial had been words, and words could be doubted. The reunion was a picture, and the picture was worth more than any statement Colville could issue. A husband and wife, reunited after 4 months apart, laughing together, the mark of a kiss on his cheek, standing side by side to face a state occasion, as a couple plainly at ease with one another. Against that image, the whispers of café society and the black headlines of the American wires simply began to lose their power. The story needed a marriage in ruins to feed on, and here, in the Portuguese sunlight, was a marriage manifestly intact. Within days, the rift story was sliding off the front pages, overtaken by the plain visual fact of the two of them together. There was a state occasion to carry off as well, and they carried it off together. The visit to Portugal went ahead as planned, the two of them side by side through the banquets and the ceremonies, a couple visibly and publicly at ease with one another. Every appearance was another small refutation of the rumour, another day of photographs showing exactly what the party girl story insisted could not be true. Slowly the headlines moved on, as headlines always do, to fresher scandals and newer faces. The rift story, denied by the palace and disproved by the plain sight of the marriage, ran short of the one thing every scandal needs, which is the appearance of truth. By the time the couple came home together, it was already yesterday's sensation. The beard, comic as the story is, carried its own small truth. A man does not grow a beard to please a court, and Philip's court did not, on the whole, approve of it. That the Queen chose to meet the change with a joke rather than a frown, gathering her solemn household into a row of false whiskers to welcome the wanderer home, says something about the texture of the marriage that no official statement ever could. It was a private language of teasing and warmth, the kind that grows only between two people who know each other very well and are wholly at ease. The world was watching for coldness between them. What leaked out instead, in the smudge of lipstick and the daft ginger beards, was the ordinary intimacy of a couple glad to be back in the same room. For the two people at the centre of it, the reunion must have carried a private meaning the cameras never caught. 4 months is a long time in any marriage, longer still when it ends in a scandal splashed across the world's front pages. Whatever the Duke had learned, out at sea, of the storm that had broken at home, he came back to it now, stepping off his long voyage into the full glare of a rumour about his own faithfulness. And the first thing that met him was not reproach, but his wife, come all the way to Portugal to stand at his side. Whatever passed between them in private, the public act was unmistakable. She had chosen him, out loud, in front of the world, at the very moment the world was inviting her to doubt him. There is a deeper truth in the sequence of it, and it is worth marking as the crisis passed its peak. The palace had tried 2 weapons against the story, and only one of them really worked. The denial, the breaking of the silence, had been the dramatic act, the thing that shocked Fleet Street and told the world how seriously the matter was being taken. But it was the reunion, the ordinary human sight of a couple back together, that actually did the killing. The institution could break its own rules and issue its unprecedented statement, and that mattered. In the end, though, what dissolved the rumour was not the machinery of the palace at all. It was the marriage itself, shown plainly, doing what no press office could do for it. The two people at the centre of the storm had only to stand together in the light, and the storm began to blow itself out. And having weathered it, the Queen did something that turned the whole crisis, at its very end, into a moment of vindication for her husband. She had defended the marriage in her Christmas broadcast. The palace had defended it with its denial. The reunion had defended it with a picture. Now she would defend it with a gift, a public, deliberate, unmistakable gesture of confidence in the man the whole world had just spent a fortnight whispering about. Days after Lisbon, she reached for an honour she alone could bestow, and she gave it to him at the exact moment the gossip was loudest, so that no one could miss what she meant by it. Chapter 14. The prince restored days after the reunion, at the height of the rift story. The Queen gave her husband something he had not carried in 10 years. On the 22nd of February 1957, by formal letters patent, she declared that the Duke of Edinburgh should henceforth be known as a Prince of the United Kingdom. It was, on the surface, a small and technical thing, a matter of style and title. In its timing and its meaning, it was anything but small. It was the sovereign herself. At the precise moment the world was questioning her marriage, standing up in the most formal way available to her and raising her husband higher. The history behind the title gives the gesture its weight. When Philip had married into the royal family a decade before, he had given up a great deal to do it. He had renounced his foreign titles, the Greek and Danish styles of his birth. He had become, formally, simply the Duke of Edinburgh, a British duke. And though the newspapers and the public habitually called him Prince Philip, he had not in fact held the formal rank of a prince of this country in his own right. For 10 years he had been a prince in name and courtesy, but not in the strict letter of the law. Now, in a single stroke, his wife corrected that. She made him, formally and forever, a prince of the United Kingdom, restoring in British form the princely rank he had surrendered for her. The sacrifice being repaired was a real one, and it had been made for her. When he married into the family in the November of 1947, Philip had given up a great deal to become an acceptable husband for the heir to the throne. He had renounced his foreign royal titles, the styles of Greece and Denmark that were his by birth. He had taken a plain British surname and become formally, simply, a duke. For a decade he had walked as Prince Philip in the mouths of the public, while being, in the strict letter of the law, nothing of the kind. Now, at the darkest hour of the rift story, his wife handed that lost rank back to him in British form, to keep forever. It was the repayment of an old debt, and she timed the repayment to be seen. For Philip himself, after 5 years of feeling diminished inside the palace, the restoration must have meant far more than protocol. Here was public proof, in the formal language of the crown, that his wife valued him and meant the whole world to know it. The man who had been squashed and snubbed by the courtiers, denied his name, walked a step behind, now carried the rank of a prince of the realm in his own right, granted by the sovereign herself at the very moment his standing was under the fiercest attack of his life. If the palace years had been one long lesson in subtraction, this was, at last, an addition, and it came from the one person whose regard he cared about above every other. The meaning of the timing was lost on no one. The record shows the fact of it plainly, that the title came days after the reunion and at the peak of the rift story, and while the record cannot read the Queen's private mind, the gesture speaks for itself. This was not the act of a woman estranged from her husband. It was the act of a woman publicly, permanently, and pointedly honouring him, choosing the loudest moment of the scandal to elevate the very man the scandal was about. Where the party girl story had tried to diminish him, to paint him as a straying, careless husband in no hurry to come home, his wife answered by making him a prince. It was a rebuke to the rumour written in the language of the crown, and everyone fluent in that language understood it at once. The public read it exactly as she intended. Here was the Queen, in the same weeks that a foreign press was picturing her marriage in ruins, formally raising her husband to the highest personal rank she had it in her power to give. A woman does not elevate a straying husband at the very moment she is supposed to be discovering his betrayal. The gesture said, in the only language a monarch truly commands, that the marriage was sound and the rumour was refuse. And it said so more eloquently than any denial from any press office. The whole point of the party girl story had been to make Philip small. Her reply was to raise him higher than he had stood in 10 years, and the reply closed the argument. It is worth being careful here about one detail, because the popular version of this story sometimes gets it wrong. What Philip received in that February of 1957 was the princely style, the formal rank of Prince of the United Kingdom. It was not the dukedom which he had held since the day of his wedding 10 years before. The two are easily muddled, and it hardly matters to the emotional truth of the moment. which is simply that the Queen chose the worst hour of the whole affair to lift her husband up. But this documentary trades on getting the facts right. And the fact is that the gift of 1957 was the prince, not the Duke. He had been Duke of Edinburgh all along. What he became, at the height of the storm, was a prince in his own right. The princely title settled the immediate crisis, but the deeper wound of the marriage, the old ache over the family name, would take 3 more years to reach its peace. That reckoning came in the early spring of 1960. By a formal declaration, the Queen confirmed that while the royal house would remain the House of Windsor, her own descendants, who did not carry the style of Royal Highness, would bear a joined family name, Mountbatten and Windsor together. It was the compromise Philip had wanted for 8 long years, the restoration of his name to his own line, and the timing of it was its own quiet message, for it came only 11 days before the Queen gave birth to their 3rd child. After 8 years of feeling like the only man in the country forbidden to give his name to his children, he was granted, at last, a share of it, on the eve of another child's arrival. The consort who had lost so much to the crown was, piece by piece, being given some of it back. It is a pattern worth seeing whole. The career taken, then a great voyage and a lifetime of causes to fill the space it left. The name denied, then handed partway back on the eve of a birth. The rank surrendered, then restored at the height of a scandal. Again and again, the crown took something from him, and again, in its own slow and formal way, it returned a portion of it. The marriage worked to the same rhythm. It took the ordinary life he might have had and gave him, in exchange, a partnership at the very centre of the nation's story, and a wife who, whatever the rows and the strains between them, never once stopped defending him. The winter of 1956 was one more turn of that same wheel, a season of loss that ended, like the others, in something given back. And the winter of 1956, seen from that distance, begins to look less like the moment a marriage nearly ended and more like the moment it proved it would not. Chapter 15. What the record holds and what it will not. Strip the winter down to what can be proved, and a harder, quieter truth is left standing. This is the chapter where the documentary sets aside the drama and asks, plainly, what the evidence actually supports, because the honest answer is more interesting than the rumour ever was. And the honest answer comes in 2 halves, one that confirms the strain and one that dissolves the scandal. Take the strain first, because it was real, and pretending otherwise would be its own kind of lie. This was a hard marriage in many ways, and the record says so. There was the temper, his temper, blunt and cutting and quick. The man who could call his wife a fool in the car and tell her she was talking rubbish and drive too fast on purpose. There was the thrown tennis racket at the reservoir in Australia and the reel of film burned to keep it secret. There was the deep, long grievance over the name, the bloody amoeba, the years of feeling unmanned by a role that walked him a pace behind his wife and denied him his own house and his own name. There was the restlessness of a caged officer who had given up the sea. And yes, there was the very absence this whole story turns on. 4 months gone, an ocean away, a Christmas missed. None of that is invented. All of it is attested by the people who were there. The marriage had strain in it, and plenty. None of that should be softened or explained away, because to pretend the marriage was frictionless would be to tell the balcony lie all over again, only in reverse. This was a union of 2 formidable and stubborn people, joined for life under conditions that would have strained any marriage close to breaking. The loss of his career, the theft of his name, the pace behind her, the goldfish bowl with no door out of it. That it produced rows and tempers, and a thrown racket by a reservoir, is no mark against it. It is the ordinary evidence of two real people living an extraordinary arrangement and, mostly and remarkably, making it work. The strain was the price of the crown, and the two of them paid it, between them, every day of their lives. But strain is not collapse, and here the second half of the answer comes in, and it is decisive. Not one of the affairs the rumour mill attached to Philip, across the whole of his long life, was ever proven. Not the party girl of the Baltimore Sun, who was never named because there was no one to name. Not the actress, not the family friend, not any of the shadows that gossip would chase down the decades. The most striking testimony of all comes from the very biographer whose work was most often blamed for keeping the innuendo alive, a serious historian who, asked about it directly in later years, called the whole thing nonsense, complete nonsense, and said she did not believe there had ever been anything in any of it. The woman the rumour mongers cited as their authority had, in the end, no rumour left to stand behind. And Philip's own answer remains the hardest to argue with. A man who for 40 years could not cross a room without a policeman at his shoulder was not a man with the freedom to conduct the secret life the papers imagined for him. The goldfish bowl was its own alibi. There is a deeper point buried in that image of the policeman at his shoulder, and it cuts against the whole premise of the rumour. Philip was, from the day of the accession, one of the most closely watched human beings alive. He was surrounded, at every hour, by staff, by protection officers, by the vast apparatus of a household whose entire business was to know where he was and what he did. A man watched that closely has no privacy at all, least of all the privacy required for the secret double life the papers imagined for him. The very machine that could not stop an American rumour could account for almost every minute of his day. Had there been anything to find, the people paid to watch him would have found it, and a wall of silence that hid a thrown tennis racket would hardly have hidden a genuine affair from every eye in the household. So the scandal, weighed honestly, comes down to this: a long absence that was real, a friend's divorce that was real, a raffish luncheon club that was real, and, built on top of those true and innocent facts, a false conclusion that was never once supported by a shred of proof and was, in the end, disowned even by the writers accused of spreading it. That disowning deserves its full weight, because it is the closest thing to a verdict the record offers. The single most cited source for the innuendo about Philip was a respected biographer whose books had lent the rumours an air of authority they never earned. Asked about it plainly, late in her life, she did not hedge. She dismissed the whole thing outright, and said she had never believed there was anything in it at all. When the chief witness for the prosecution stands up at the end of the trial and says there was never a case to answer, the case is over. Everything left is smoke, and smoke, however thick it hangs, is not the same thing as fire. None of this is to make Philip a saint, and the honest record does not ask anyone to. He was a difficult man, sharp-tongued and short-tempered, capable of coldness and of small domestic cruelties, as the thrown racket and the fast car and the cutting words in the passenger seat all attest. But being difficult is a very different thing from being unfaithful, and a bad temper is no evidence of a secret life. The rumour asked the public to leap from the one to the other, from a husband who could be harsh to a husband who was betraying his wife, and between those two there was never any bridge at all. A hard marriage is not a broken one. That is the distinction the party girl story deliberately blurred, and it is the distinction the whole honest record sets straight again. The rift story was a structure of insinuation raised on a foundation of the mundane, and when the winter passed, the structure fell down, because there had never been anything holding it up. So the winter of 1956 leaves a strange and honest residue once the noise dies away. It was not the story the American papers told of a marriage cracking apart over a woman who never existed. Nor was it the story the palace told of a union without a single flaw, serene behind its balcony. It was a third thing, harder and truer than either of them. A real marriage, with real strain in it, tested to its very limit by a long absence and a friend's disgrace and a hostile press, and found, at the end of the test, to be sound. The rumour was false, the strain was real, and the marriage was stronger than both. Which brings the story back to that extraordinary denial, and to what it truly meant, because this is the point the whole documentary has been reaching toward. When the palace broke its century of silence, it did not try to disprove the affair, because it could not prove a negative about a woman who did not exist. What it denied was the rift. It denied that the marriage was in trouble, and that denial, unlike almost everything else the palace ever said, was the plain and simple truth. The machine that had been built to hide things, the wall of silence, the abominable no man, the burned film, and the managed broadcasts, had spent years concealing the real strains of a real marriage. But when it finally spoke, in February of 1957, it spoke to defend something that did not need concealing at all, because it was true. The marriage was not over. The marriage was not even close to over. And the proof of that would take another 64 years to finish writing itself. Chapter 16. Strength and Stay. 40 years after the palace swore the marriage was not over, the Queen rose at a wedding lunch and settled the question herself. The occasion was their golden wedding, the 50th anniversary of their marriage, in the November of 1997. 50 years had passed since the austerity wedding in the ruined post-war city. The two young people had become an old queen and an old prince, and the whole long argument of their life together, the strain and the devotion, the rows and the loyalty, the 4-month absence and the rift that never was, could now be read whole, from beginning to nearly the end. And standing to speak at the anniversary lunch, the Queen said the truest thing anyone ever said about the marriage, and she said it in public, to the whole country, in her own voice. "He has, quite simply," she said, "been my strength and stay all these years." It was a plain phrase from a woman who did not deal in extravagant language, and that is exactly what gave it its force. Strength and stay. The man the American papers had once painted as a straying husband in no hurry to come home was named by his wife, in the fullness of their life together, as the thing that had held her up through all of it. And Philip, in his turn, offered his own dry summary of what half a century of marriage had taught him, that the one essential ingredient of any happy union was tolerance, and that the Queen, he said, had the quality of tolerance in abundance. Between the two remarks lay the whole truth of the partnership. She was his strength. He gave her, and she gave him, the tolerance to endure a marriage lived in a goldfish bowl, under a crown, with all the strain that came with it. Stand that scene beside the winter of 1956, and the distance between them is the measure of the whole story. In 1957, a foreign paper had told the world this marriage was ending. 40 years on, the same marriage stood in a hall in London, while the Queen, a woman not given to displays of feeling, told her country in her own voice that this man had been the strength that held her up through all of it. The rumour had lasted a few weeks. The love it slandered lasted a lifetime, and longer. And the one person in all the world best placed to know the truth of the marriage had just settled the question for good, not with a denial from a press office, but with a plain word spoken from the heart at a wedding lunch. The numbers of the marriage, at its close, put the winter of 1956 in its proper place, which is to say a single hard season in a very long and enduring whole. They were married for 73 years, the longest marriage of any sovereign in the history of the British Crown. The other numbers keep it company. They marked their golden wedding, 50 years, in 1997. They reached their diamond wedding, 60 years, in 2007, the first British sovereign and consort ever to do so. They passed their platinum wedding, 70 years, in 2017, a milestone no royal marriage in the country's history had ever touched. Philip served as consort for 69 years, longer than any man before him. He carried out more than 22,000 solo engagements across the span of it. And through all of them, from the austerity wedding to the very last, he was the one fixed point at the centre of her life, the constant around which the whole long reign turned. Philip served longer as consort than any man before him. He carried out his last public engagement at the age of 96, and then, having given the crown almost 70 years of service, he retired. He died at Windsor Castle in the spring of the year 2021, some 2 months short of his 100th birthday, and the image of the whole country that day was the sight of his widow, the Queen, sitting alone and masked in the great chapel, a solitary figure at the funeral of the man who had been her strength and stay. She followed him the next year, dying at Balmoral in the autumn of 2022, and they were laid together at last, side by side, the sailor and his Queen. Set that ending beside the rumour of 1957, and the distance between them tells the whole story. A foreign newspaper had once printed, in bold black type, that this marriage was cracking apart over a party girl who never existed. The marriage went on to last 73 years and to end only with death, and its final public image was not of estrangement, but of a widow bereft, grieving the one person who had ever treated her as simply another human being. The rift story was smoke. The strength and stay were real. And the palace that broke its silence to say so, for once in its guarded history, had told the plain truth. That is the quiet vindication the whole winter had been waiting for. And it took 64 years to arrive in full. The palace had broken its silence in 1957 on a kind of faith, defending a marriage whose strength it could not yet prove to a skeptical world. Time proved it. The marriage the Baltimore Sun had tried to bury outlived the newspaper, outlived the century it was born in, outlived very nearly everyone who had ever whispered about it. When the final reckoning was complete, the score was not close. One printed rumour, dead within weeks. One marriage, 73 years long, ended only by the grave. So return, at the last, to the quay in the October of 1956, and to the Queen standing there, watching her husband's ship pull away toward the bottom of the world. For 4 months, the distance between them would grow until it could grow no further, out past the ice, out to the loneliest islands on the map. A friend would fall, a newspaper would print a lie, and the most silent palace in the world would break the habit of a century to defend a marriage it knew, better than anyone, was not breaking at all. The machine had been built to hide strain, and there was strain enough to hide. But the thing the rumour claimed, the collapse, the ending, the rift, was the one thing that was never there. She watched him sail away across the widening water, and she knew, as the men who built the wall of silence knew, that whatever the world would say in the weeks to come, he would always come home. He was her strength and stay. He always had been. And across 73 years and 2 oceans and 1 long, cold, slandered winter, he always would be. If a story like this one, the human truth underneath the official version, is the kind of history you want more of, I would be glad to have you subscribe and stay for the next one. And I would love to hear from you in the comments. Do you think the palace was right to break 100 years of silence to defend the marriage? Or should it have said nothing and let the story burn itself out? Tell me what you make of it, and where in the world you are watching from.